And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio here on the Big Talker 106.7 FM. It is our unique pleasure to be speaking with a man who is in the future around the world. We're speaking with Professor Sinclair Davidson. He's a professor of economics at the RMIT University in Melbourne, Australia, and also an adjunct economics fellow at the Consumer Choice Center and a host of other organizations. Sinclair, thanks so much for jumping on the air with us today.
Thank you for having me, and hello from the future.
There we go. He knows what's going to happen, guys. So principally, I wanted to bring you on. You are obviously an academic who writes about many topical things that we discuss and the things that we focus on, but also that I think are of grave concern to everyone. And most recently, you're co-author of a book, Unfreeze, How to Create a High-Growth Economy After the Pandemic. And I wanted to read a quick line. I don't know if it's from the book or it's from many of the journal articles that you guys have been publishing with your co-authors. Governments cannot freeze an economy, thaw it out months later, and expect it to come back to life. Economies do not hibernate for the winter like a sleepy but otherwise unharmed and intact bear. Unless some specific steps are taken, steps we will outline in this book, the most likely outcome is that the economy thaws into a pile of mush. Sinclair, how do we avoid the mush post-COVID?
Well, we have to start off by diagnosing the economy correctly. And a lot of people have the view of an economy as a machine. And unfortunately, this comes from the social engineering aspects, which are even taught in economics programs these days. You know, you tweak this, you twiddle that, and then all of a sudden the economy does that or the next thing. So the economy is not a machine. So you have to start off by saying it's not something, it's not a computer where you just hit the sleep button and it switches off and you hit it again and it just roars back to life again. The economy is an organic network of people interacting. And it's those people's dreams, their aspirations, their plans that are all moderated and coordinated by the price mechanism. And what has happened is that during the COVID crises, governments have just come in and they've said, let's stop this, let's freeze that, let's slow this down, let's kind of speed that up. So there's been this massive intervention in the economy in a massive central planning approach. Now, we know central planning fails. We know it has never worked anywhere in the world where it has ever been attempted. And even now, even though governments have come in and in March of this year, they may have had good reason for trying to do this, I still think the economic damage from the policy response to COVID is going to be massive and is still being underestimated even as we speak. So this week in Australia, the government announced, the Australian Bureau of Statistics announced that the economy had grown 3.3% in the last quarter. And this is a massive rebound. Today, they're actually reporting, this is your future, my present. Today, they're reporting that by June of next year, our economy will be back where it was before COVID. Now, when I walk down my main street on the CBD of Melbourne, I see on every other store these massive for lease signs or going out of business signs and all this sort of stuff. So do we really believe that by June of next year, all those stores will be restocked, will be reopened, will be the same businesses or a slightly different business operating in that store? Because that's what they're telling us. Whereas in actual fact, what they're really saying is that our GDP may be very similar to what it was, which I don't believe it will be. But what they're really saying is that people's lives will be back to where they were. And I'm sorry to say that it's just not true. Economies are about people, their dreams, their expectations, their hopes. And to avoid all of that going to mush, there are a whole bunch of things governments need to do. And the first thing is they need to deregulate. We've had massive regulation build up over a long period of time. That regulation is no longer fit for purpose. The economy that regulation was regulating is gone. So if we need regulation, well, we need to think about what it is. We need to reimagine our labor market policies. We have very, very sticky, rigid labor markets. And if you look at how governments are behaving, they kind of think we've got a spending problem. You know, we're just going to pump money into the economy. Our national debt is at levels not seen in peacetime ever. So we don't have a spending problem. We've actually got a working problem. We need to get people back to work and having jobs, getting them out of the house. Then, of course, one of my favorites always, flatten the tax system, promote entrepreneurial behavior through permissionless innovation. We like to think that we have a system whereby you can go out and do whatever you want, and then the government will come and regulate you. In actual fact, nowadays, you need to get the government's permission to do almost anything. And this has worsened during COVID. Here in Australia, we actually had a thing called a permitted worker, somebody who was allowed out of their house to go to work. You had to have a like an internal passport. The police would stop you at a roadblock and say, "Where is your permit?" Absolutely shocking. And then, of course, subsidiarity. I'm a huge fan of driving political decision-making down to the lowest possible level. Unfortunately, we live in a world where even in federalist systems, unfortunately, we have these great centralizations occurring. So subsidiarity, drive decision-making down as far as you possibly can. And these are the sorts of things that are going to actually allow us to grow ourselves back into prosperity. It's not just a case of our GDP's got to be back to where we were. It's a case of our lives have got to be back to where they were. And that is what is important here, not just some arbitrary measure that gets produced by the government every quarter. So that's what I think needs to be done, and that's what our book was about.
And a couple follow-ups there. When you talk about the idea that the economy is an engine, I can't help but think back to, and I'm sure that you've seen this, but many of our listeners probably have not, the Keynes versus Hayek rap.
Yes.
Yeah, I encourage anyone listening to listen to the Keynes versus Hayek rap, and there's a great quote in there where the actor obviously playing Hayek says, "The economy's not a car, there's no engine to stall, no expert can fix it, there's no it at all. The economy's us, we don't need a mechanic. Put away the wrenches, the economy's organic," which is a really foreign concept for people who don't think about the economy that way. They think, oh, okay, well, this month it's projected that the GDP of Canada has rebounded or has grown 40%. It's like, okay, well, that's great, but there's still a list of 140 restaurants that are permanently closed in Toronto, and those are not coming back.
That's correct.
My follow-up on the labor market side of things, or what I like to call the Uberization of everything. We've seen, and Yaël and I have talked about this quite extensively, laws like AB 5 in California, where legislators will attempt to apply old, often outdated labor market restrictions on the gig economy. Is that something that you're seeing in Australia as well? Because from our perspective, for Yaël and I, for us, it's a no-brainer. We should be moving in the direction of open markets, of more mobility, and making the space less sticky. But I'm wondering if that is the mindset of legislators down under, or if they're kind of falling into that trap of wanting to treat gig economy workers like traditional laborers.
Our regulatory system for a long time has had that hostility to the gig economy, even before the gig economy was a thing. So for a long, long time, our tax office, for example, which also administers our superannuation system, which is like our private pension system, for a long, long time has been waging war against what it called contractors. Because the whole purpose of the contracting system was more or less to engage in regulatory arbitrage away from those aspects of the labor market which made it impossible to employ people. And bearing in mind, when it's impossible to employ people, it's impossible to meet consumer demand for goods and services. And so businesses that actually wanted to put on contractors and have more flexibility would be harassed by the authorities, would be harassed by the tax office, would be harassed, of course, by labor unions and all those sorts of things, because they were introducing that flexibility into meeting consumer demand. So what we actually have in the last, since the Industrial Revolution, we've seen a massification of how the economy works. And when you have that massification and you have things happening at large scale, it obviously becomes very easy to regulate everything as being the same. So you have a lot of conformity. What has happened since the end of I call it the industrial economy in scare quotes, but we still have an industrial economy. But what has happened as a result of the information technology changes and the digitization of the economy is that we can now have more of a niche economy where we can meet specific needs and demands. Now, that kind of undermines the massification and conformity and the one-size-fits-all approach that we've adopted since the Industrial Revolution. And of course, when our economy was a one-size-fits-all approach, our regulatory system was a one-size-fits-all approach. And so we actually need to start regulating things that need to be regulated on a niche basis, because I'm not going to say we have to have no regulation at all. But what I am going to say is the regulation for the Industrial Revolution is inappropriate regulation for the gig economy.
We're speaking with Professor Sinclair Davidson here on Consumer Choice Radio, the Big Talker 106.7 FM. Professor Davidson obviously covers a lot of economics over there at RMIT University, and we're talking a little bit about technological change and sort of reshaping the economy. I have to mention, of course, that you are one of the pioneering academics in the field of blockchain and cryptocurrencies. I have to mention that, very important. And I'm wondering, I'm seeing a little bit of innovation there. I've followed it for a long time, and there's a lot of very interested people who would love to see some kind of grand evolution. Does this kind of COVID moment allow for, since we're all working online, conducting this interview online, adapting to work at home, is there a kind of path or avenue where we're going to have some kind of grand permissionless innovation thanks to cryptocurrencies or blockchain that comes out of this? Are we heading in a good direction or a bad direction? What are your thoughts there?
I think in general, we are moving in a good direction. I'm incredibly optimistic and bullish around technology and what it's going to do and how it's going to enhance human flourishing.
And that's not just because the Bitcoin price is at an all-time high, but okay.
No, no. But if you're thinking about buying Bitcoin now, you should have bought it a few years ago. But yes, I'm incredibly bullish and optimistic about the technology. And it's not the cryptocurrency itself that's important. It's all the other things that come with it. Now, we have had a COVID moment. There is a great deal of corporate and institutional hostility to digitizing, because I reckon there were first mover disadvantages. No one single employer would suddenly say to all their people, listen, why don't you go home and sit in your garage for 6 months and work from there? Whereas when COVID came along and government shut everything down, all of a sudden, everybody got sent home and told, work from home if you can, make do with what you can. So at the beginning of the year, I thought programs and products such as Skype were magnificent. Now I'm kind of thinking, gee, Skype, that's like old world technology. I'm thinking now Zoom and all these other things. So we've all simultaneously had to overcome the first mover disadvantage. We've all had to do things. We've all had to be entrepreneurial. We've all had to reinvent new ways of doing work. I don't think we're going to go back 100% back into the office and do things like we used to. I actually think there's going to be a lot more working from home, because that taboo against your manager not being able to stand over your shoulder 24/7 is suddenly gone. We know for many people you can work from home. We've had to upgrade our technology. We've had to change ways of doing things. There's been a lot of entrepreneurial discovery that has occurred in the last 6 months or 8 months or so, and that's going to flow forward going into the economy. And also the changes in the CBD. We no longer need all that office space. So there's going to be a lot of things happening so that are very exciting. And there's a lot more acceptance of digital activity than what there was. So that's all a positive. But I think it was Bill Gates who kind of said that we always overestimate what's going to happen in the next 2 years, and we underestimate what's going to happen in the next 10 years. I would love to say to you, there's going to be a big boom, and then all of a sudden, the crypto economy is going to be here. I think it's going to be incremental. And the biggest challenge right now is actually making the crypto economy user friendly. Right now, it's actually not that particularly user-friendly. And until it becomes more user-friendly, we're not going to see wide-scale adoption. So I think the entrepreneurial space right now is, one, bringing new products. I mean, a lot of the DeFi stuff is very interesting. That's certainly going to hollow out the banking system, I imagine, in the next few years. A lot of the supply chain stuff is also very interesting. That's also going to change how business is done there. It's also going to change a lot of branding and, you know, all those peripheral industries, but it's not going to be one big boom. I think the Facebook Libra project, I think, is particularly interesting because right now Bitcoin and a lot of the other currencies, cryptocurrencies online, are still something of a niche market because we have that user interface which isn't very friendly. But when Facebook comes along, if you can send a Facebook message, you will be able to send money. And so I'm actually very hopeful and excited that Libra will be a launching pad to the widespread adoption of cryptocurrency.
So yeah, one follow-up on that is we've had someone like Peter Schiff on the show before. He obviously falls into the gold bug category of someone who's quite anti-cryptocurrency. Their criticism is that these currencies are too volatile. They're treated like speculative assets, so much so that they can't realistically be used as a means of exchange. Do you buy that argument? Do you doubt, or do you think that volatility is something that the space is going to have to deal with for a while?
There are actually two points in there. I actually agree with the notion that Bitcoin can't really be used as a currency. So I'm going to upset the Bitcoin maximalists out there. So sorry, guys. There is a lot of confusion around the functions of money, and there's a lot of confusion around that function of money, which is called the store of value. Now, we know a currency is a medium of exchange, a user account, and a store of value. And everybody says to us, Bitcoin is awesome because it's a fantastic store of value. Now, what people are doing there is that they're using the plain English language meaning of the store of value. So if I bought Bitcoin in 2012, let's say before the first big boom at, I don't know, $1 or so, and now it's worth 24,000 Australian dollars, I think, wow, what an awesome store of value. I had $1, I've now got $24,000. That is not how economists talk about the store of value. When economists talk about the store of value, they are talking about inflation and deflation. So for a good money, my dollar must be worth more or less $1 today, $1 next year, $1, or the purchasing power must be more or less $1 today, $1 next year. It must have been $1 last year. Because if the currency is inflating, becoming less valuable, what that gives me is an incentive to buy more stuff now. That distorts the economy. If the currency is becoming more valuable, that gives me an incentive to not buy stuff now and to wait. That also distorts the economy. So the store of value is a story around monetary neutrality, the impact the purchasing power has on the economy. So unfortunately, a lot of people say Bitcoin is a great store of value, where in actual fact, Bitcoin is a great investment. Now, if you are having an investment, you love volatility, because the next time Bitcoin falls in price, I'm going to buy some more. But if you are thinking about money, you hate volatility. I don't want to turn up next year and suddenly discover that my dollar isn't worth very much. So Bitcoin itself is not a good money, and I'm putting money in scare quotes here. Bitcoin is a great investment, and the technology underpinning Bitcoin is awesome. But for money, we actually need to have things like stable coins. They're going to be far more valuable as money. And so when you look at something like Libra, they're going to have a portfolio of assets underpinning it. I don't know how exactly they're going to do it, but I imagine they are going to use Markowitz's frontier work after Harry Markowitz won the Nobel Prize in 1990. They're going to form, I suspect, a zero variance portfolio. And more or less, this is going to be Hayek's commodity money in digital space. So it's got great pedigree, great ideas. Will have the store value aspect, which Bitcoin doesn't have. So I love Bitcoin. I love the cryptocurrencies. But I really get very frustrated as an economist when I see people carry on about what a great store of value it is. It's a terrible store of value. It's a great investment.
There you go. We don't recommend financial advice here on the program, but there'll definitely be a lot more to come from that. So I'll definitely point to much of your research, Professor Davidson. You have a fairly good academic cred when it comes to this. This is not the first time that you're talking about it. And I believe you lead an entire blockchain department or project in Melbourne. Is that correct?
I'm one of the team. Yes. I'm not the leader.
That is, yeah.
In a previous life, I was a university administrator, so I try to avoid all of those leadership things. But I'm one of the two professors in the unit. Yes.
Well, as an economist, you also know how to avoid particular parts of work and admin and red tape. So I do do say that's a lot of courage there. So we're speaking with Professor Sinclair Davidson here. He's also a contributor to the Cadillacsy Files, CadillaCyFiles.com, one of the longest running center-right blogs across the world, certainly in the Anglosphere, based there in Australia. And there's so many topics that you've been able to hit on there that I think would be of interest to our audience. But one I wanted to get your take on fairly quickly has to do with any of these public broadcasters. Obviously not a problem necessarily in the United States, but a huge problem in the United Kingdom and Canada, also in Australia. You know, why do you have a beef with down there, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation? Why do you think these things should be privatized or at least subject to competition? What's that all about?
The Australian Broadcasting Corporation was developed in the 1930s here in Australia, based upon the British Broadcasting Corporation, and the British Broadcasting Corporation had this charter to entertain and inform. Now, if we kind of think of how the world looked like in the 1920s and 1930s, there was a massive media shortage. There were very few places where people could get news and information from, and dare I say, there may even have been some sort of market failure. Now, bearing in mind that this market failure, which occurred in Australia and the United Kingdom, did not occur in the United States. The United States had a very different regulatory, open broadcasting approach to anybody could start up a radio station in the United States. But in the United Kingdom and Australia, obviously, you couldn't. And so the government stepped in and built these organizations to provide news, entertainment, information in a world of shortage. Now we fast forward 18, 90 years. We no longer live in this world of shortage. We live in this world of surplus. There is absolutely no shortage of information being flooded into the world, to the extent that people now complain about fake news and not true news and all this sort of stuff. So we now live in a world of not surplus. We live in a world of gluttony of information. And I'm going to say this is an awesome thing. This is a good thing. This is fantastic. But nonetheless, we have these organizations which still kind of try to act as gatekeepers, try to tell us what to do, how to think, how the world is, which of course in and of itself is immoral. But the worst aspect of it is that they use the coercive power of the state to finance themselves. They've also become, in my view, extremely left-wing. And that in and of itself is not necessarily a problem, but because journalists tend to be intellectuals, and Schumpeter told us that intellectuals tend to be left-wing, they tend to question, they tend to undermine the institutions of society, and there is a role for that. But I do think, though, that there's no reason why the government should be taxing everybody to pay for it. There is a market for it, and people want to pay for that sort of stuff. They should be allowed to pay for it. I don't want to pay for it. Now, in Australia, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is paid for out of general revenue taxation. In the United Kingdom, they have a special tax Well, they don't call it a tax because taxes are bad. They call it the licensing fee. And the licensing fee is paid to the BBC. And they pretend it's not really a tax. But it is a tax because if you don't pay it, people with guns come to your house and take you away, just like any other tax. So, we shouldn't, it's all this fiscal illusion that we have in the world. It's not a tax, it's a levy, it's a price, it's a this. If people with guns come to your house, it is a tax if you haven't paid it. The Australian Broadcasting Corporation gets funded to the tune of $1 billion Australian dollars every year, year in, year out. And the problem is it makes them lazy in addition to being left-wing. When the food's on the table when you get there, you don't have to work for it. You don't have to earn it. You don't have to go out and get a customer. You don't have to be responsive to consumer demand. So it's a producer collective. And the governments have failed to exercise any serious control over it. They more or less run around, do what they want, harass people, destroy lives, use the power of the press to pursue particular avenues. And again, if there was a private organization, well, there's competition in the market. There's competition in the market for ideas. But these guys do not compete in the market. They simply exist. And so my view is they should be privatized because it is valuable. It's not worth nothing. We don't know what it's worth because it's, the socialist calculation debate, bureaucrats can't tell you what something's worth. So we should privatize it. And my argument is we privatize it by giving it away for free to the current employees, the shares. And when they sell the shares, they will obviously have to pay capital gains tax on selling the shares. And when they pay the capital gains tax, that is when the government will be paid for the value of the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. So a very nice, neat market solution to this problem.
Very interesting idea. And another thing that's very common that a lot of people don't realize, and this is like the seen and unseen, is the spillover effect on the advertising market. So when you have a public broadcaster that openly takes advertising dollars, they undercut the private sector, and private broadcasters struggle to compete for advertising dollars because in the Canadian example, the CBC has $1 billion head start and can't go bankrupt. So it creates a lot of disparity and skews the marketplace, and then they line up at the trough for money, and it just creates that kind of vicious cycle.
Well, what is happening in Australia is that the Australian Broadcasting Corporation is not allowed to take advertising dollars. So we don't quite have that problem. But what we do have is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation broadcasts a lot of children's shows. And the ABC is exempt from the local content laws that the free-to-air channels are required to do. So the ABC gets some of the best children's shows from all around the world and broadcast them advertising free and with no local content rule. And so what happens is a lot of people watch the kids ABC show and they don't watch the free-to-air kids shows because that does distort advertising in that sense. The other thing that it did do, we actually had a private fact-checking media company that got put out of business when the ABC started up their fact-checking company. But of course, the kind of facts that the ABC fact check are not quite the same facts that everybody else would kind of want to check. So they tend to fact check a lot of center-right politicians and not so much center-left politicians. And there's always very subtle nuances whereby a center-right politician is wrong, whereas if the same thing had been said by a center-left politician, it might not be so wrong. So those sorts of biases come in as well. So we don't have the direct advertising bias, but we do have the crowding out effect. Now, there still is a problem because they don't have to attract advertisers, they don't have to attract paying customers, they don't have to worry about attracting eyeballs either. So one of the things the ABC does is every year they commission research. How well loved is the ABC? And about 80% of the population love the ABC. And then you have a look at their ratings. But only about 15% of the population watch the ABC. So it's one of those things, everybody loves it, but nobody watches it. So yeah,
Yeah,
pursuing us all
there's
around.
plenty of that. I think we can say that for many governmental programs as well. But that's a whole other conversation for another day.
Yes.
You've been listening to Consumer Choice Radio. We've been speaking with Professor Sinclair Davidson, phoning in, connecting the Anglosphere from Melbourne, Australia. Professor Davidson, thanks so much. You can also follow him on Twitter at Sync Davidson. Read his blog, Cadillacsy Files, where he has many other authors on that blog, one of the longest running center-right blogs in the Anglosphere. His research, we'll link to everything in the show notes. Professor Davidson, thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me.